we have two more events for today. We have this session, and then we have a very exciting set of breakout discussion rooms following this. So I hope everyone can stick around and participate through these last couple of really great events of what's turned out to be a fantastic conference and workshop that I've really enjoyed. Today we have with us Danae Hernández-Cortés. She's an assistant professor at the School of the Future of Innovation in Society and the School of Sustainability in Arizona State University. Danae studies the distributional consequences of environmental policy and environmental justice. Her work uses applied causal inference methods with remote sensing techniques and atmospheric transport models to analyze the environmental justice consequences of environmental policy. She got her PhD in economics at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and her BA in economics at CIDE in Mexico City. Jessica Boakye is an incoming assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering at UMass Amherst. Her work focuses on modeling community risk and resilience metrics. She got her PhD in civil engineering, societal risk, and hazard mitigation at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Daniel Carrion is an assistant professor of environmental health and sciences at the Yale School of Public Health and director of education for the Yale Center on Climate Change and Health. He works at the intersection of climate, energy, and health inequity, aiming to produce research that not only identifies disparities, but opportunities and leverage points for equitable interventions. He got his PhD from Columbia University and did a postdoctoral training at the Econ School, and I'm not sure how to pronounce that, of medicine at Mount Sinai. And finally, Andrew Curley is a member of the Navajo Nation and an assistant professor in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment at the University of Arizona. He has studied the social, cultural, and political implications of coal mining on the Navajo Nation. He got his PhD in development sociology from Cornell University. So we're going to start out with Danae, and let's make sure we are ready. Danae, are you here? Would you like me to share? Oh, you've got it. Oh, good. It worked. Good.
It worked? Perfect. Yeah. Oh, yes. Is it working well?
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for introducing me. I am very excited and humbled to be in this presentation and also to be sharing the panel with such amazing set of researchers. My name is Danae Hernández-Cortés, and I am going to talk a little bit about how causal inference methods and some other tools from the economics field can help us analyze restorative justice and some of the remaining questions in the field, and how they, what are some of the research gaps that within the work that economists have been doing to try to analyze these issues. So first of all, I would like to say that as we have seen in all of these past couple of sessions, we can be sure that energy transitions are happening right now. And within these energy transitions, climate policy needs to address climate change in a really unequal world. This gives us so many opportunities for us that to enable some policies that will not only try to address these climate change issues, but can also address other issues too, such as energy poverty, pollution disparity, and more importantly, past harms to disadvantaged communities. So the overall question that I am going to be trying to explore throughout this short talk is how can decarbonization policies help close disparities and avoid future harms, and how different methods can help us illustrate some of these issues within these research questions. So first, let me just say again what many of us have been saying the last couple of days, which is that it's very well documented that polluted places are also poorer and have more minorities. So for example, if you look at the left-hand side of this figure, you will see that the census tract color in white, you will see that they are the ones with lower income, and the ones that are in red are those that have higher income. And those little circles that you can see there are the toxic release inventory facilities that are heavily polluting facilities in the US. And as you can see, most of the white census in this map, most of the white census tracts and also yellow census tracts are the most polluted, that also tend to be the ones with lowest less income. So those are the ones that have a higher density of toxic release inventory facilities. Now, if we can see the same in the case of minority populations. So in this graph right here, we can see that if you divide the pollution in 20 equal share distributions, you can see that the census tracts with larger shares of pollution are also the ones that have a higher minority of Black populations. So this is some examples of how these disparities have been existing in this are existing in the United States. Part of my own calculations, you can see that places that are also poorer have a higher amount of PM2.5. This is in the case of California, and also census tracts that have higher linguistic isolation measures also experience higher pollution in terms of PM2.5. So all of this is to say that we know that these environmental justice and issues exist, and how we can leverage policy that could reduce those gaps. Now, I would like to emphasize that none of these things that I am saying right now are new. And indeed, all of them have been built in the work by Dr. Robert Bullard, that has been the father of environmental justice, that has brought some of these issues that have been existing in the past couple of years. Of course, when we think about environmental justice, as Anna in her keynote lecture emphasized, environmental justice is achieved when there's a meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of their income, color, national origin, or race. And there's equal enforcement and implementation of environmental policies across all of these communities. And also, no group experiences a disproportionate share of a policy's negative environmental consequences. So as she mentioned before, there are three main dimensions of restorative justice in this framework. The first one is the recognition of disparities. The second one, the procedural justice. And finally, the distributional justice. Now, within this framework, there are many relevant questions that both academics and also more generally communities have been trying to emphasize. So among these questions is whether these environmental disparities arise because polluters are located near disadvantaged households, or whether disadvantaged households face unequal opportunities to services that could help them prevent for these pollution disparities, as well as how pollution policies disproportionately affect disadvantaged households. In reality, most of these issues are occurring in the larger scale. So now the question for us as researchers is, how can we analyze these questions using some of the tools that we have acquired throughout our studies, and how we can try to come up with some interesting solutions that could help address those issues. So I will be explaining a little bit about how some tools from the economics framework can help us answer these questions. And in particular, I would like to emphasize that economics tools most of the time rely on causal inference methods and statistical analysis, also theoretical models, to learn about the underlying causes of environmental disparities. In so doing, we are trying to study specific case studies, or more relevant, some policies that can shed light on solutions more broadly about how to reduce these disparities. So among these approaches that we try to examine, there are three main big themes with associated questions. The first one of these themes is trying to document disparities in pollution exposure. And basically, these studies try to analyze how big is the pollution gap among different groups. Now, there are other studies that are trying to document mechanisms, as Katie explained in her past lecture. And basically, these studies try to analyze why there's a gap and why do we see that these things are happening in aggregate. Finally, there's also other studies that are trying to evaluate policies in order to try to analyze how can we close the gap of these existing disparities. And now let me put it all in an illustrative methodological framework. Some of the methods used by economists are using models, either theoretical, some other models about cost-benefit analysis, together with causal inference methods and statistical analysis, as well as case studies, in order to analyze these general themes, which is first, relationships between trying to understand what is the disproportionate impact of these environmental of environmental hazards among disadvantaged populations, some of the mechanisms trying to explain why that is happening, and finally, try to illustrate examples using some policies in order to illustrate how using some policies could either close or exacerbate those gaps. And in order to do it, we usually use different types of data. And among those data is administrative data that can help us see about the development of some programs, or administrative data on health issues, geographic data as well, using some census tract level data or county level data, as well as environmental risk data obtained from satellites or other sources that can help us analyze some of these hazards. Now, I am now going to give some examples on how this framework works. So first of all, in the documentation of these relationships and answering the question on how big is the gaps, the work done by economists complements existing work in other disciplines that document existing disparities. So to do so, some of this work uses empirical methods to quantify gaps, as well as constantly different tools to try to understand what is the source of existing gaps. And as you can see in this figure, some work done by Jonathan Colmer and co-authors have shown that the pollution levels in the US have declined, but the disparities still remain. So within this analysis, this is some of the questions that are being answered. Now, this is, as I mentioned, this is not something that economists have done by themselves. And indeed, this has been a long history of environmental activists and environmental studies among some other scholars. For example, the United Church of Christ in 1987 showed that it was one of the first studies that documented existing disparities, showing that race proved to be the most significant variable associated with the location of commercial hazardous waste facilities. These studies have given some of this background that has helped some researchers to try to analyze the sources of these disparities and some of the mechanisms driving existing disparities. Now, as other researchers have done, we can see that across most classification, people of color have experienced highest levels of pollution. And this is not only work that has been done by some by people in the economics field, but rather a larger contribution to existing literature by other fields. Now, in the second theme that I wanted to explain, it's the mechanisms theme. And this mechanisms theme tries to analyze why is there a gap in pollution disparities. And I think that this is important to try to analyze because it helps narrow down the reasons of injustice. For example, is this injustice based on the actions done by firms, or is it political participation in the permitting and decisions made at another level? Or there are differences in enforcement. So all of these are questions that are trying to be answered by looking at these mechanisms. And I will argue that understanding these causal channels is crucial for designing policies to reverse the observed correlations that were answered in the previous slides. And among these contributions done by some economists, Van Saff et al. Have identified 4 main mechanisms that could be driving these disparities. And among these disparities are the disproportionate siting of firms, household coming to nuisance or information about their environmental hazards, quotient bargaining between communities and other actors, and discriminatory policies, enforcement, or behavior that could be driving these disparities. Now, the next part of these themes is trying to analyze how does policy affect existing disparities, or how do we close the gap in existing disparities? And to do so, the work by economists that has been done tries to analyze how can environmental policy reduce environmental inequality. In particular, this work tries to analyze the policy incidence of environmental policies. And this work usually says that ex ante there's a gap in environmental exposure, and the question is, how can environmental policies reduce or increase the gap based on their design?
Just a couple more minutes. Just time.
Perfect. So this causal inference brings us some tools to try to understand what is the main reason behind this policy design. Now, I will quickly explore give an example of this framework using some of the work that I have been doing together with MLab at UC Santa Barbara that examines the equity consequences of the decarbonization of oil and gas sector in California. So in this study, we try to analyze this big question that is, what are the equity consequences of energy transition in the oil and gas sector in California? And we start by this example of the landscape of LA that will be very recognizable for those who live in LA. And you can see that refineries and oil wells tend to be located very close to the homes of populations. And now, for us to analyze this question, we created a framework that could leverage several decarbonization policy levers that we couple with a model of oil refining and extraction in order to try to understand what are the air pollution consequences, the labor market impacts, and the greenhouse gas emissions reductions in order to understand what are the equity consequences of some of these policies that we were analyzing. And among these, the most important part is that we were trying to understand what are some of the consequences in terms of pollution exposure that could, what are some of the environmental justice consequences of these decarbonization policies that could affect some disadvantaged communities. And ideally, what we would like to see is that if we have the exposure by disadvantaged communities, we would like to see it reduced compared to other non-disadvantaged communities. And what we did was to try to do a source attribution method in order to see how pollution dispersed around LA and try to see how the different policies could change the distribution of pollution if targeted different refining activities. So for example, if one policy target this refinery could have different environmental justice implications than targeting this refinery, which allowed us to understand some of the different benefits and cost analysis in terms of distributional outcomes for these communities. So this was just an example of how we use this economics framework in order to analyze one policy question. And in the last minute that I have, I would like to say some of the remaining questions for deep decarbonization that at least I think that are missing in terms of the economics research. And the first one within the documentation of GAPS team is what are the main pollution sources and where are they located with respect to underserved communities, as well as what are the cumulative and long-run impacts of pollution exposure in these communities. In terms of identifying mechanisms, I think that there's a lot of room for improvement to try to understand how historical discrimination policies shape current disparities and how does procedural justice improve environmental outcomes in these communities. Finally, in policy incidents, I think that some of the gaps right now is how energy policies exacerbate existing inequalities and what is the role of policy design in increasing or decreasing existing disparities. And without any more time, I would like to thank you, the organizers, for including me in this program, and I look forward to the other presentations.
Great, thank you so much. And before we move to Jessica's presentation, I was remiss in reminding everyone, please do drop questions you may have as we go in the Q&A for the discussion afterwards. Very much invite that. And also I've dropped the link again to the Google form for anyone who might have any research data sets they're aware of, other resources they want to highlight for us to include in our synthesis. So Jessica, why don't you go ahead?
Is everyone seeing my screen and hearing me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll just jump in. So to start off with, I just wanted to highlight first an example I think everyone is very familiar with, the ice storm that occurred in Texas last year. And I wanted to point out here in this news clip that the emphasis here is on keeping warm, and on the bottom, I want to direct your attention to this idea that also schools were closed. And on the other side, I would like to talk about the idea that there's an issue in privacy when talking about autonomous vehicles, which are one of the many different solutions that people have been thinking about in works related to deep decarbonization and net zero. And so my point in both of these is to point out that issues with energy and deep decarbonization actually affect multiple facets of individual well-being. And so my idea here is that we need to focus on how we can actually measure and quantify these facets of well-being that people care about. And so that's going to kind of be my focus of the presentation. So with that motivation in mind, I broke up this presentation into 4 main questions. The first one is what framework we could use to define well-being. And so for that, I'll introduce a capability approach. The second is how could we turn this abstract definition into something quantifiable? And so for that, I'll talk about the use of capability approach indicators. Third, I want to know what restorative justice really looks like in this framework. So that's going to be the bulk of the presentation. And for that, I will spend a lot of time talking about the capability approach in groups. And I'll end by bringing up some of the challenges. And since I'm an optimist, of course, the associated opportunities that come in this framework. And for that, I'll be briefly talking about selecting capabilities, uncertainty, and intergenerational justice. So let's get started on the first question. So the capability approach was first developed by an economist and a philosopher. And so capabilities are defined as the genuine opportunities that individuals have to achieve valuable doings and beings. So examples could be being educated or being employed. The important part here is then that capabilities can be framed or conceptualized as dimensions of well-being. And the second important part here is that whether an opportunity is genuine is actually dependent on many factors, right? Including what individuals have and what they can do with what they have. So to further illustrate this concept of capabilities, let's look at an example capability of being educated. Well, actually, if we start thinking about being educated, it depends on a number of factors that include but aren't limited to things like access to technology, access to transportation, societal norms that would allow for the education of both boys and girls, and access to school buildings. So now that we've had some idea of how we could have a framework to define well-being, let's now talk about how we could actually quantify these things. I'm an engineer by training, so I'm really interested in how I can put numbers to this framework. And so since capabilities are not quantifiable, indicators are chosen as proxies that are easily measured or estimated. So for example, in the case of one that is measured, we have the Human Development Index that is put out by the United Nations, and it looks at 3 different indicators. The first is life expectancy at birth, average education level, and the standard of living. And so for the case where indicators are going to be estimated, well, that's where I've focused a lot of my work on. And this is when we look at scenario modeling to estimate the indicator. And that's when we would use a combination of things like existing models, digital twins, and probabilistic methods in order to get an estimate of the indicator that we're interested in. So then the indicators which are measured from existing data can be used to evaluate interventions over time. And so we could then check if individuals' capabilities are actually improving as expected, or if there are unintended consequences in other capabilities. And so, for example, we may check if people are reporting less food insecurity following the installation of solar fridges. And scenario modeling allows us to test out possible interventions. And so we may choose the intervention which maximizes individuals' capabilities. And so I wanted to note that this is very different from just minimizing costs or emissions, but we may start our solution set from some cutoff value for those if we need to have an initial set of scenarios to evaluate. And so now for our third question, like what would restorative justice look like in this kind of framework? So for restorative justice, that really requires us to look at groups within a capability. And so I've been talking about individual well-being, and I would be remiss in not pointing out that Frances Stewart has done pivotal work in making sure that the capability approach is actually able to handle groups. And so when we're doing this kind of group analysis, we first actually have to define groups of interest within the community. So in my figure here, what do these green, purple, and blue individuals actually represent? And I think that speaks to the recognition justice that Anna was talking about earlier. And so once we have these groups, we can then analyze the capabilities across them and see which groups have disproportionately lower attainment, and that could be at the point of analysis or historically. And we can also look at spatial inequality and attainment across the communities, and then again, looking at that distributional justice. And here I want to point out that interest has to be given to groups which have faced historic inequities. And these groups should be given priority and be included in the discussions through procedural justice. I'll talk about one form of procedural justice that I see in the coming slides. And here, again, just echoing what a lot of other people have been talking about in the groups that have historically been disadvantaged. We have lots and lots of data. Community groups have been telling us this for years and years. This is not anything new. I do want to point out that Justice 40 itself seems to be an attempt and a first step at this. So to end, I'm going to just briefly talk about some of the challenges and associated opportunities. So the first challenge would be selecting capabilities. And I should point out that there is a disagreement among scholars among which capabilities to consider and for which application. The important part of that is that that disagreement has led to practitioners choosing capabilities on an ad hoc basis. And that has a lack of transparency and is something that we need to avoid, especially in this space. I would argue it's something we need to avoid in any application space, but especially now. And so I think that brings up an opportunity for us to think about procedural justice and interdisciplinary research. We must engage the communities when we are selecting capabilities, and we have to also engage them when we select our indicators. And so this is really a back and forth process. We first need to make sure that we are capturing the dimensions that communities care about. And then we need to make sure that the metrics that we choose are actually capturing those dimensions. And second, I think that engineers and policy makers need to engage with social scientists to figure out the best ways to engage the public without being transactional. As was pointed out earlier, there are people who study this, who know the best way to engage with communities. And so it's really important that those of us who don't have that experience lean on those other folks so that they tell us how to do these things. The second challenge I would like to bring up is uncertainty. So I come from a hazard analysis space, and so this is kind of a newer process when we're talking about a transition. And so that means there's going to be a deep uncertainty, which could come from multiple sources like a lack of data or just the inherent uncertainty that comes with modeling these kinds of human decisions. How the human decides to turn their thermostat is just a really important consideration in this conversation. And sometimes it's unclear where the uncertainty is coming from, how to model it, and how to make policy decisions around it. So that gives an opportunity to implement some risk analysis methods that have been used for similar kinds of procedures where there's just a lot of uncertainty floating around. And the final challenge that I would like to bring up is trying to incorporate intergenerational justice. So this idea that the decisions that we make today are going to affect generations that come long after us. And how can we make sure that decisions that we make are actually good? I would be remiss in not saying that this is very parallel to me from an engineering perspective of the fact that we are now kind of living with the infrastructure decisions that were made long ago. And I think a lot of those people thought they were making really good decisions, right? And so this gives us an opportunity to explicitly account for the capabilities of future generations. And I'll point out that some work has been done on this in explicitly considering the capabilities of children, but I think we need to go further than that. And so that gives us an opportunity to work with sustainability experts who really understand how to work in these kinds of long lifetime cycles that we have to move into. So to summarize, my presentation really focused on 4 questions. The first was what framework we could use to define well-being. For that, I introduced the capability approach. The second was how could we turn this abstract definition into something quantifiable? And I briefly talked about capability approach indicators. The third was what does restorative justice really look like in this framework? And I talked about the capability approach in groups. And finally, what the challenges and associated opportunities were. And I briefly talked about selecting capabilities, uncertainty, and intergenerational justice. And with that, I will thank everyone for their attention. And it's been a pleasure to serve on this panel and be with all of these great researchers. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, Daniel, you are up next.
All right, all set up. Thank you very much to the organizers for putting this together and inviting me. I'm really excited to give you some high-level thoughts on what restorative energy justice looks like from my vantage point from being an environmental health scientist. And I'll kind of say from the get that my kind of perspective is moving towards what I would call a double mitigation approach, which I think speaks very much to what people have been speaking about in terms of multi-objective functions for this type of work. Let's see. And so I should first mention that grappling with justice is important from all of our disciplines. And I think from the environmental health standpoint, a lot of environmental justice literature has really been focused on distributive justice. I don't think that's specific to environmental health, but is worth noting because I don't think we have explicit frameworks for thinking about restorative justice. But from my vantage point, this was actually pretty straightforward insofar as restorative justice to me means leveraging energy transitions to counteract historical health disparities that we face in this country. So as a quick background, you're probably familiar, but health disparities broadly refers to a heterogeneous collection of the various health outcomes that we see differences by subgroup. And so some of those most marked of those differences are by race and ethnicity, but also by gender and queer identity. And the social scientists in this field, social epidemiologists, really talk about how health disparities really are an embodiment of the upstream inequalities that we see in our society. So that historical and present day forms of inequity make it under people's skin and manifest as differences in health outcomes. And so this health disparities can be cut up and viewed in many different ways. You can see here, I like the Kaiser Family Foundation has made this graphic that compares different racial and ethnic groups with white populations, basically saying with a set of 61 different indicators, does that group have better or worse performance on these indicators, on these health measures? And as you can see, and is unlikely surprising for folks, that Black, Hispanic, American Indian, and Native Hawaiian folks report much higher levels of health disparities for many of these 61 various indicators. So for me then, this really speaks to the fact that we really need to utilize energy transitions to work against these health disparities and work towards health equity. And so an equitable deep decarbonization from my standpoint then really is the integration of energy transitions that both maximize reductions in greenhouse gases, but also maximize reductions in health disparities. Of course, there are many different paths to deep decarbonization, and we need to consider all of them when we're thinking about this as tools in our toolbox to achieve this double mitigation. But I'm going to quickly drill into using residential electrification as an example, as this is where I'm spending some of my research attention on currently. So we know that residential electrification is a real opportunity for reducing greenhouse gases. It's approximated that 20% of greenhouse gases in the US come from homes, come from the residential sector, and about half of that is for heating and cooling. But what we know less about is whether or not residential electrification can actually help us make gains on health disparities reductions. And from a researcher standpoint, what this means is we have to decompose this into two underlying questions. Can residential electrification help us decrease psychosocial and or environmental exposures? And are those reductions sufficient enough to actually yield improvements in health? Residential electrification takes many different forms. So much of the literature has been focused on cook stove transitions, but there's also important work to be done in terms of space heating and cooling, and also water heating, as these are the different forms of electrification that can take place. And so as I mentioned, most of the literature has been focused on gas stoves, which we know from that literature that gas stoves in the household, especially in tightly weatherized spaces, can yield very high exposures to various air pollutants, from carbon monoxide to nitrogen dioxide, particulate matter, and volatile organic compounds like formaldehyde, which are all known to have health consequences. And we also know from this literature that exposures from these gas stoves are actually implicated in asthmatic exacerbations. And as someone mentioned earlier in this research, this is actually an important leverage point because Black children, for example, have 1.5 higher levels, 1.5 times higher levels of asthma. And Hispanic Latine children also have high levels, with Puerto Rican children having 2 times the levels of asthma compared to white counterparts. And as I mentioned, we know less about the potential health impacts of space heating and cooling transitions. So moving from things like furnaces to heat pumps, or water heating, like solar hot water heaters or electrified hot water heaters, rather than fossil fuel burning hot water heaters. And so there's many ways in which we need to expand this literature and learn more about the potential benefits of residential electrification. So for example, much of the work that's been done has really focused on indoor levels of air pollution. But you can imagine with something like a furnace to a heat pump transition, that would also yield ambient differences in air pollution, since much of the combustion byproducts are vented outdoors. So this is an important opportunity to learn more about the potential air quality benefits of these types of transitions, but also to learn more about non-respiratory outcomes. So many of the studies that you've heard so far that have focused on health oftentimes use asthma, and asthma is a very important health disparity for us to focus and spend time on. But at the same time, it's not the only health disparity. Part of my service work is that I sit on the Minority Health Council of New York State. And in the 5 years that I've been on that council, the community members and academics and other constituents who sit on that board as well, I think we've discussed asthma once. And so there's a real opportunity to learn more about the non-respiratory health outcomes of these potential transitions. We've also spoken about energy insecurity, and there's a real reason to believe that things like residential electrification could actually help us make a dent on energy insecurity, as in the long term, it could offer long-term savings for the household and also reduce price volatility, since the electricity market is likely less price volatile than natural gas or oil market, which can manifest potentially in mental health benefits due to potentially differences in reductions in stress. And then also, there's an opportunity to think about this from the standpoint of improving thermal comfort. So things like heat pumps can also act as cooling during the summer. And we know that with a warming climate that we are seeing more and more heat-related mortality. And particularly for low-income and BIPOC communities that have been found to be more vulnerable to the consequences of high ambient temperature, this is a real opportunity to learn more about this and potentially intervene with these forms of deep decarbonization. There are, of course, data gaps here in this literature and what we need to do to move forward. As I mentioned, thinking about other non-respiratory health outcomes and mental health is important, but then also how to transform disparate health outcomes into common metrics that we can then use to compare different forms of decarbonization so that we know where we would get the quote unquote best bang for our buck in terms of health disparities reductions. So some paths forward here is while there is a lot of opportunity to learn more, we do have sufficient evidence and research to act. Folks have done work using things like emissions modeling and exposure modeling combined with health impact assessments to help us to think about where we can target transitions based on what we currently know in the literature. And I think someone made reference earlier to the great work that's been done in places like UCLA that's been doing some of this work to try and target those transitions. And that different forms of deep decarbonization are probably going to yield different benefits in different geographies based on the nature of the technologies and the subgroups that live in different areas. But there's also a real opportunity to learn while doing. So by that, I mean, there are transitions that are already underway in this country, and we should tack on health evaluations to try and characterize the potential benefits and differences that we see with those decarbonization pathways, and then update our priors accordingly so that we can know if we've made the right investments in different locations and update those dollars accordingly in different areas. And I think that this is an important opportunity to use community-based approaches. So I've just started to work in the residential electrification space because community groups actually in Connecticut reached out to me and my center and colleagues to say, we want you to do research in this space. And so there's a saying in Spanish by the Zapatistas that loosely translates into lead by obeying. And so the goal here is to lead research efforts by obeying what the community is telling us to research. And there's a real opportunity to do that.
Daniel, just a quick time check to wrap up. Oh, which you have
Yep.
done.
So I made reference to several different things, and thank you very much. Looking forward to the Q&A and discussion with my colleagues.
Great, thank you so much. And last but not least, Andrew, the floor is yours.
Hey everyone. My name is Andrew Curley, and I'm on Acoma land using their internet, so thank you very much. I'm going to quickly go over a lot of slides and try to stay within my 10 minutes. I wanted to think about the history of extractive development, not only on the Navajo Nation, but in Indian country more generally, as a goal to understand the political context of development and questions of energy transition within Native nations. And when we come to the title of this panel, thinking about restorative justice, I was thinking, well, we have to know a little bit about the history of injustice, and particularly when we're talking about tribes, the history of federal Indian relations. Just to give you a quick context of some of the pressures that we face as indigenous nations, these are the known coal reserves and power plants, at least by 2014, when I took this map, and a couple of those, at least one of those power plants have closed, and coal mine. But this gives you a sense of, it's an overlay between the known coal reserves and the reservation lands, the large land-based reservations. You can see with my cursor that the Navajo Nation is here in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, and has a lot of coal beneath it. And a lot of the large land-based tribes in the West are near coal areas, and these have historically contributed to pressures to develop and utilize those resources. The same is true with oil and natural gas. The same, we find them having the same kind of patterns of distribution around Indian country. And the infrastructures carrying some of these resources across the space through and around Indian communities have created their own kind of pressures. You've probably heard of the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women's campaign about human trafficking involved in construction sites around these pipelines and these infrastructures. Also, you had the protests around DAPL in 2016 of crossing water and potentially risking the water for the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. And the DAPL is right there, as you can see, right on the edge of the reservation. So when we're thinking about the effects of extraction and energy within Indian country, we have to also appreciate that these are uneven impacts, that there's a spatial unevenness, and it's largely dependent on this type of resource in vogue, the type of resources that utilities, as the previous presentation was talking about, what are utilities buying and what are they consuming, and what is it that's being produced. And what ends up happening in the case of coal, we have a collapse throughout the country, and especially in places like the Navajo Nation, the Hopi tribe, the Crow Nation, Northern Cheyenne, places that have historically, for the last 40, 50 years, used coal as a form of development, revenues, and other kinds of mechanisms for getting resources to the community, whereas gas and oil have increased over time. And you can see this just in the percentage of the US total that's being generated on Indian lands between 2003 and 2014, from 0.5% to almost 2%. And I've really looked through the EIA's website to try to find a more updated table to show this information. Unfortunately, I was unsuccessful in that. But this, I think, gives you kind of a sense of what's happening here with the collapse of coal and the increase of oil production. Now, when we're thinking about the history of injustice in Indian land, we have to think about settler colonialism, and colonialism as an unanswered and unmitigated problem. Colonialism is a landed project. It was the replacement of native peoples from their lands with a settler population, often taking over the most important resources, such as water resources or land for agriculture, displacing indigenous peoples to places that they didn't think were initially valuable, and then finding value later on. As a lot of people write in the literature of settler colonialism, colonialism is a structure. It's not an event. It's a continuing policy within the United States as part of federal law. It's the basis of a lot of interactions between the federal government and tribal governments. And so these things are built into extending federal policies, including things called Justice 40. You're going to continue to maintain colonial relationships so long as colonialism is unmitigated, to use climate change framing. So to understand the nature of land within Indian country, we also have to understand that just land in itself is not just completely under the sovereign authority of tribes, even though we have exercised a lot of sovereignty over the years. But we have a difference across Indian country between treaty land and executive border lands, and all the kinds of regulations that the federal government is able to exercise within these places, and consequently the kind of rights you have to resources based on when you get your lands added on and put into what's called trust status within the federal government, meaning that it's held in trust. The title is held by the federal government. We have occupancy rights with certain authorities to decide on what we can do with the land, with the water resources, and with the subterranean resources. When we're thinking about the current state of development and political sovereignty within Indian country, we can think about a lot of this stuff happening in the 1930s during the initial New Deal, during the time of trying to change Indian policy. Before that, there was an emphasis on allotting and selling off surplus land, as they called it. This was outright colonial land theft, and assimilating indigenous peoples. And what I created a table here that maybe can help us understand the difference between federal policy and development approaches in Indian country and how these things have complemented each other over time. And what we have in the 1930s is the Indian Reorganization Act that created the basis for the modern tribal governments that you interact with today. So the Navajo Nation, the Accoman Nation, Hopi tribe, all of these nations that have modern political governments, often in the form of tribal councils with presidents or chairmen. These things go back to this congressional act in 1934. And almost concurrent to the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act was the Indian Mineral Leasing Act, which gave the authorities to sign leases with large extractive companies within those lands like that are understood like on the previous map that I just showed you, with certain kinds of authorities that are contained with those lands, with those trust lands. And eventually those powers expand over time. So we can say that the anchor is here in the 30s, and then new kinds of authorities are added on over time. There's a lot more in history to go into to kind of explain the difference between 1934 and 1975, but for a time, we won't go into that. What is probably most relevant for people at the federal level who deal with tribes on a regular basis is this idea of government to government relations, whereas that you're supposed to treat tribal nations as if they're another sovereign. Unfortunately, a lot of those government to government interactions are only scheduling meetings, but without giving veto power to tribes. And that's something that tribes have been asking for a long time, is that if you have a project and we disagree with it, we should have the right to veto those projects. And currently we don't have those rights. And that's something that you can think about when you're thinking about restorative justice within Indian country. We can think also like in terms of the different kinds of industries and the legacies of those industries on land. In Navajo Nation, I'm showing you a map. This is a place I know best. This is where I've done my research. And we have different overlaying legacies of extractive industries. We have coal that's represented here in the power plants, and then the uranium mining that had occurred a generation before the coal mining from the 40s and the 50s. And I got a couple of slides to show you some interesting historical nuggets of information based on that. Here we have where the oil production looks on the Navajo Nation. But one thing I wanted to point out about uranium mining that had happened in the 1940s, between 1947, roughly around 1947 and 46 to 1981 is when it stopped in the Navajo Nation, is that the federal government started to notice back in the 60s that there were deaths due to lung cancers from uranium workers in the area, especially the Grants uranium belt. We didn't get this information until the 80s, 20-year gap between when information was known about the dangers of uranium mining to when we start to respond to it. And that's years after people have participated in industry with reduced covering, with unclean clothes that would then bring in contamination into the home, even and contaminate children and other people in the household. So there's a huge inequality in how we think about the legacy of uranium mining in Indian country, especially around the Grants uranium belt, where I'm at right now, actually. And we had just a lack of concern from the federal authorities thinking about how these projects were being administered and the kinds of contracts that were being allowed. You can see this is some archival work I've done where I found this photo celebrating 1968, a Navajo person, touching the uranium mining and handling it as a new industry in the reservation, 2 years after Congress is already discovering that there's high levels of uranium contamination among uranium workers in the Grants uranium belt. So for sake of time, I'm going to skip to some thoughts to leave with, and that's kind of the legacies of the bust that we've experienced most recently here on the Navajo Nation and in the Southwest. And with the decline of coal, there are some of the socioeconomic problems that we see are the 440 lost jobs that at the coal mine specifically, and some included at the power plant. These are Danae workers who spent maybe decades. Some of them spent more than 20 years working at these mine sites, and got all of their on the site job training and developed the skill basis to work there, and then are suddenly lost without any other kind of economic opportunity, or either forced to retire or transfer to a different mine. And then some of the environmental legacies are the land loss, the amount of land that has to be set aside and restored, pun intended, to what is thought of as its original status before coal mining commenced. But sometimes we wonder, and people that work in our mineral office on the nation, whether or not it'll ever get to a place where we can use it again for subsistence activities like sheep herding or small scale agriculture, those kinds of things. So fundamentally, the land is transformed in ways that have to be used in a different way. But I think a lot of indigenous peoples, activists, and EJ movement types are responding to this legacy and thinking through some of the questions of power and distribution and environmental inequality. And this is a mural that I like to highlight in my presentations. That's outside of ASU downtown in Phoenix, which shows you the history of the Central Arizona Project and the coal mining infrastructure that moved water from Colorado River into Phoenix, allowing for this kind of superficial use of it on the golf course. All of this was signed in 1968 in this hotel, the Westward Ho, between Johnson and then Senator Carl Hayden. And it's kind of, with spatial proximity, we have these indigenous artists that put forward a different kind of ideological understanding of this and critique of the history of extraction and resource inequality within the region, and showing on the other side different kinds of technologies that they want to prioritize that seem to be more consistent with native ideologies of development and sustainability, and that includes small scale farming, sheep herding, wind and solar, and other kinds of things. So I think the culture about these questions are changing somewhat. But there's definitely a huge infrastructure that's still intact that is taking water and energy and moving it towards Phoenix, and at the expense of Indian water rights. So I'll stop right there, and whatever I didn't cover and anybody has any questions, we can talk about later.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Okay, so let's all turn on our cameras, the panelists, and we can move to some Q&A. There are just a couple of questions that have popped up in the Q&A, but they're a little bit specific. So maybe I would ask that one or the other of you could maybe just go in and type some answers to those ones, or if you have any couple of thoughts. I have some kind of overarching discussion questions that I've noted down over the course of this that I'd like to dig into. So Andrew, I just following off of yours, I had one question, which was, we've talked a lot over the course of these couple of days, especially just given the context of Justice 40 and how, they're defining things based on this idea of, benefits metrics and things like that. I just wanted to kind of pose a question about, like, given the nature of the sort of disenfranchisement and kind of the power dynamics sort of removing the level of autonomy that, you know, sort of was to be expected or was supposed to be present in terms of the historic context. I had this thought of like, you know, when we talk about energy justice or things like that, you know, oftentimes people are talking about energy democracy or people having agency over the choices in their lives. And I just wanted to pose the question of like how it sits to conceptualize the idea of the degree of agency people are able to exhibit in a decision being a benefit metric itself, as opposed to just a process point. And I'm just kind of curious if you have any thoughts on that.
I don't have any thoughts on the metric of agency, but I think it's important. I guess while you were asking the question, I was thinking about what is unique about Indian country in making these decisions, and it's tribal sovereignty and the language and literature of tribal sovereignty. And whenever we propose a question that's about any of these topics towards tribal communities, it has to be within the conversation of tribal sovereignty.
Yeah, understood. So kind of opening up to the general panel, I think going back again to this idea of, so it's just something that I've been thinking a lot about when it comes to Justice 40, since the way that that's been structured, we have this idea of, you know, defining these, like the indices or like defining what we mean by disadvantaged communities as being one distinct step. And then having kind of a separate step being this one of defining the metrics of benefits, so to speak. And, you know, that's something that's sort of echoed to a certain extent in many of the studies that we've all talked about, not just Justice 40. But I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts on the idea of, you know, this idea of indices or inputs to those indices and the benefits metrics themselves, that there's a lot of gray area between those things, and sort of how we might grapple in these different frameworks with the idea of finding ways to integrate those two things so that we're looking at changes in status in terms of the indices side of things, you know, in the outcomes that we're looking at. And I know that in some ways that's just a technical question, but I think it is also a conceptual one. So I wondered if anyone had any thoughts on that.
I can take a stab. So one of the reasons why I particularly focused on health disparities as the kind of outcome that I was going for mitigating is because health disparities is the manifestation of all of the inequities from the health standpoint. It's an integration of the social exposures and the environmental exposures that are disproportionately impacting communities. And so in that way, it kind of speaks to the fact that maybe we don't need some of the interim data, because if we're making moves on improving health for disadvantaged communities, then at least from my standpoint, that's the end goal. And so that's kind of my sense. I think there's a lot of devil in the details of which health disparities do you use as the right measures, as the right outcome measures for this, because different communities experience different health disparities. And so up front, you know, it sounds simple, but of course there's a lot of important detail that needs to be worked out there. But nonetheless, to some degree, it kind of skirts some of that problem.
Yeah, Danae, go ahead.
One of the things that, well, I completely agree with what Daniel just was saying, but I think that one of the biggest discussions that come when we see at these indices is, well, indices are not perfect, but it allows us to measure something. And we know that from some of these past presentations, we know that some of these indices have different variables, different aggregation measures, different units of observation. So we know that they are not perfect and they vary a lot. But I think that looking at them is better than just focusing on one set of in one measure. And it is based also into what Danielle was just saying, that perhaps these health metrics are very good because they get of all these cumulative impacts and put them in very simple terms that can help us understand these gaps, which I think I completely agree. But I think that one thing that we do that it's important to focus on is what is the aggregation and the unit of observation that we want to analyze, because we know that if we look at a county level measure, that could have so many issues, as well as we look at zip code level. So I think that one of the things that we can do moving forward as we build these indices is try to agree on some level of aggregation that we can compare across different metrics that could lead us to certain different questions.
Great. Anyone else have any thoughts on that question? I do have more questions. Okay, last chance. Okay. So my next question is, so, you know, as for myself being trained as an economist, you know, I remember in grad school learning about, you know, the way that we approach things in economics, where we tend to wrap everything up in in monetized terms so that we have everything kind of aggregated into a single unit. And that's been a theme of some of the discussions of the last 2 days, of different approaches being more or less comfortable with different types of you know, multi-objective approaches versus trying to aggregate things up into common units. And I just wanted to kind of bring that forth again. And maybe first, question for you, Danae, in terms of your perspective, also from an economics background, whether like, are you aware in economics of any sort of, I know that in some ways it's sort of just codified into the entire approach that's used in economics, but it is something that I think is a non-trivial piece of what we do that can really obfuscate a lot of other issues. And so I'm just kind of curious if you're aware in economics of any threads that are sort of challenging the, you know, kind of monetary valuation component of, or sort of like, you know, standard of how we approach things.
I think that there have been several attempts to try to do so. I think that one of these attempts, I think it was explained by Ishan later previously, about trying to improve this quantification, because just looking at the social cost of carbon as we had seen it before does not give us a lot of detail about how it's happening within a very small scale. So I think that there are several attempts to do so. I think that one good element about this framework is to try to put into perspective, in terms of the energy transition more broadly, how different, what are the trade-offs that we could have. So something that has been mentioned before is that this energy transition could also cause some employment effects, even though it can also benefit cause some benefits in terms of health. So I think that trying to quantify that, even though it's not great, could lead us to try to analyze some of these trade-offs that could be very relevant for the communities that we are examining. So yeah, I think that like this quantification is not great. It has several issues, but at the end, it might allow you to have a sense of these trade-offs that could be important.
And I'm curious if anyone else on the panel, you know, if there's any sort of thoughts just on that question of, you know, multi-objective approaches or approaches like that versus, you know, basically just how we grapple with the fact that we're looking at a lot of dimensions of impacts, and how different disciplines sort of try to make that tractable versus deal with the trade-offs of sort of, you know, once we try to simplify that can sometimes either disenfranchise further or obfuscate some of the underlying issues.
So I guess I would just caution us to think that we always need to aggregate to just one singular metric, because what that really means is that I believe that I can substitute one dimension for another. So if we're thinking about something like shelter and food, if I aggregate, that means that if you don't have an adequate shelter, I'm saying that I can just give you more food. And we know that that's incorrect. So as much as possible, I think it's important to kind of separate things out. And I think that there's a lot of research out there that proves that populations that are going to be food insecure, also going to be energy insecure, also going to have issues with education access. So sometimes we're like trying to solve a problem that might not even exist, right? I think we need to just see what's actually out there when we do these analyses across the dimensions that communities really care about. And if we end up with more communities, then we end up with more communities. But I think right now things are getting a little bit too like mixed up, and we're missing the underlying issues of what's causing the real disparities.
Yeah. Anyone else have any thoughts on that point? Okay, I think so. We're going to wrap up in a moment. I have one more question, I think for you, Andrew. So just in terms of, you know, you were kind of highlighting in some of the history that you were laying out in your slides of, you know, there's this sort of this issue of the relationship between the tribal history and industry, right? Where on one level we have the, you know, the extraction, we have the exposure to environmental damages from those industries. On the other level, they are a source of, they have been in some cases, right, a source of jobs, a source of economic growth. You know, when we're talking about the energy transition, you know, there is this element of that, you know, you hear in sort of the political discourse of, you know, trying to invest in industries of the future, right? So we're gonna, you know, there's going to be more battery manufacturing, or there's going to be, you know, solar manufacturing, or et cetera. And we know that there are potential challenges with that also from an environmental justice and exposure perspective. But there are opportunities in terms of jobs. And so I'm just kind of curious from your perspective, when you're kind of looking forward to the energy transition, what do you see as the biggest like potential opportunities that exist versus the biggest cautionary pieces that at least from current, you know, viewpoint are points of primary concern from that context?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'll try to be quick. There's a lot to say. I think that you know, in the course of some of the research I was doing, looking at energy transition in the 60s, we're looking from in Arizona when the state and state planners were moving from a proposed hydroelectric dam to a coal-fired power plant. Of course, they weren't thinking about carbon and some of the costs of climate change, and everything was kind of a win-win situation for everyone. Tribe will get development and jobs and revenues, and we can get the water infrastructure we need. And it felt like there was a lot of parallels with the kind of optimism in the conversation at that time when you look at the way things played out and the political horse trading that was going on between the Secretary of Interior and different congressmen and governors and et cetera, that put into place this large dominating structure that had unknown and unimaginable consequences over a 40, 50-year period that now we're starting to understand and grapple with. And so it's like, when we're rushing and making quick decisions and with this kind of looming idea of crisis, what are kind of these unintended costs that, you know, you can't really quantify? And if you did, I don't know what it would look like. But the other thing that I was thinking about was, again, and what I was trying to emphasize here was understanding tribal legal landscape, because I witnessed an attempt to try to do a transition campaign in 2009 on the Navajo Nation, where they put into law this idea of a Green Jobs Act and Green Jobs Fund to try to appeal to to funding from the federal government, and it just didn't work for a lot of different reasons, and partly because it wasn't attentive to the structure of the tribal government, to the authorities, and the way that it was thinking about development since the 1930s. So I think, you know, if you're going to do things in Indian country, you have to understand those things. And that's kind of the takeaway point I was trying to get at in the presentation. So that was as quick as I could do it. Thank you for the question. Well,
thank you so much for the insight. So I think we will wrap up for now. Anna just dropped in the chat a link to the Zoom that will be used for the breakout discussions. They're going to start in